Okay, so y- we always start these deep dives with a number that kind of sets the stage right.
Mm.
And today's number is a big one, like a
Yeah.
really big one. We're talking 2.1 billion people.
Wow.
Yeah, 2.1 billion. That's a full quarter of the entire world's population.
Yeah.
And get this, they all live in places that are considered fragile contexts. So, like we always say on this show, we want to get past just the headlines
Yeah.
and really dig into what's going on, right?
Mm.
So today, that's exactly what we're going to do. What does this idea of fragility actually mean for all these people?
Mm.
And maybe more importantly, what are we learning about how to make things more resilient, more strong, more able to bounce back from tough situations? Because let's face it, a stable world is a world where everybody has a chance to thrive.
And for this deep dive, we've got a fantastic resource to help us unpack all of this, the OECD.
Oh, the OECD.
Yeah, so they put out this report called States of Fragility 2025.
2025. So like pretty up to date.
Yeah, it's hot off the presses. I mean, the bulk of the data is from 2023. So we're looking at a very recent snapshot of what's happening globally. And what I think is really valuable about this report is how broad it is. It doesn't just focus on conflict like a lot of reports do.
Right.
It really takes this holistic approach. It examines all these different factors that contribute to fragility: economic, political, societal, human, even environmental dimensions.
Oh, wow.
And on top of all that, it incorporates actual voices and perspectives from people who are living in these fragile contexts.
Oh, that's like firsthand accounts.
Exactly. And that just adds so much depth to our understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we've got our roadmap, we've got our resource.
Mm.
Where do we even begin with something as massive as global fragility?
Well, first things first. We need to define our terms.
Oh.
So we're all on the same page. So we're going to spend some time unpacking what fragility really means in this context and how our understanding of it has, evolved over time. Then we're going to take a look at the current state of fragility around the world. Where are the hotspots?
Right.
And we'll pay special attention to one particular region that's really been in the news lately: the Middle East and North Africa. The MENA region.
Yeah.
We're also going to break down the key indicators that experts use to identify and measure fragility. Like, what are the red flags, essentially?
Okay, so we're going to get pretty specific.
Yeah, we want to give you the tools to really understand this stuff. After that, we'll explore some of the most important lessons that have emerged from efforts to address fragility. What's working, what's not.
The successes and the not-so-successes.
Right. And finally, we'll shift our focus from just reacting to fragility to proactively building resilience. What does that actually look like? What are the tools, strategies, and success stories out there?
Wow. I mean, this is a lot to cover.
It is, but I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of this.
Yeah.
Like you said, a stable world is a world where everyone thrives.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's start with the basics.
Mm.
What exactly do we mean when we talk about a state or a system being fragile?
Right. So at its core, fragility is about how well a state or a system can adapt to shocks and stressors.
Okay, so like unexpected events or changes.
Yeah, exactly. Without experiencing a major rupture or collapse. So it's about being able to bend without breaking. And these stressors can take many different forms.
Yeah.
It could be shifts in power dynamics.
Like who's in control?
Exactly. It could be grievances, whether they're new or long-standing. Those underlying tensions or frustrations that exist within a society.
Yeah.
And then you've got all those rapid changes driven by technology.
Oh, like the internet.
Yeah, social media, artificial intelligence, the whole digital landscape. It can be really destabilizing, especially for governments and institutions that are struggling to keep up. Then, of course, you've got environmental changes, climate change being the big one these days, but also things like natural disasters, resource scarcity,
Right.
and then economic disruptions, things like recessions, price spikes, unemployment. These can really undermine the stability of a state. And last but not least, you've got changes within the very institutions that govern society.
So like political reforms
Yeah.
or even just like how the government operates.
Exactly. So a fragile state or system is one that's particularly vulnerable to these kinds of stressors. They lack the capacity, the resources, the adaptability to cope effectively.
And that's where things can start to go downhill, right?
Yeah, and that's where we start to see those headlines about conflict, instability, and humanitarian crises. But here's the thing. Our understanding of fragility isn't static, it's evolving.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just a fixed definition.
Nope. We're constantly learning more about the complexities of fragility, and the actors involved, both state and non-state actors, are increasingly looking at the sources of risk and resilience in a very strategic way.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow you.
So they're not just seeing these as problems to be solved for the common good.
Right.
In many cases, fragility itself is being instrumentalized.
Instrumentalized.
It's being used as a tool, as part of these broader strategies to achieve specific political, economic, or security goals.
Oh, wow. So, like, some actors are actually benefiting from instability.
Yeah, and we see examples of this in Africa and the Middle East, where instability can be leveraged to gain influence or control over resources.
So it's like a strategic advantage for some.
Unfortunately, yes, it adds a whole new layer of complexity to the situation.
That's pretty disturbing, actually. So we've talked about how fragility is this evolving concept, but the report also makes it clear that it's not just about war and conflict, right?
Exactly. That's a really crucial point. Fragility is multidimensional. It goes way beyond just the presence or absence of armed conflict.
Okay, so break that down for us.
So think of it as these different layers of fragility.
Yeah.
You've got economic fragility. This can manifest as low or unstable economic growth, high poverty rates, a heavy dependence on a single volatile resource.
Stable, for example.
Exactly. Or minerals, anything that can create these boom and bust cycles that make an economy very vulnerable.
All right.
Then you've got political fragility. This can involve things like weak or ineffective governance, lack of democratic processes or institutions, widespread corruption.
Okay, so like the government's not functioning properly.
Right, and this can create a lack of trust in the government and make it very difficult to address the underlying challenges.
Yeah, I can see that.
Then there's societal fragility. This is all about divisions within a society, lack of social cohesion, deep ethnic or religious tensions, inequality, discrimination. All of these things can create a very fragile social fabric.
And that makes it easier for conflict to erupt.
Exactly. It creates these fault lines that can be easily exploited.
Okay, what else?
Then we have human fragility. This is a really broad category that encompasses things like poor health outcomes, limited access to education, inadequate housing, poverty, food insecurity, and low levels of overall well-being.
So basically people's basic needs aren't being met.
Yeah. And when people are struggling to survive, it creates a very volatile environment.
Makes sense.
And finally, there's environmental fragility. This focuses on the impact of environmental degradation and climate change. Things like deforestation, pollution, soil erosion, water scarcity, extreme weather events. All of these can exacerbate existing fragilities and create new ones.
Wow. It's almost overwhelming when you lay it all out like that.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
But it's really important to understand how interconnected all these dimensions are. They don't exist in isolation.
Go give us an example.
So let's say a country is heavily reliant on agriculture for its economy, and then they experience a severe drought.
Right.
Now, that drought, that's an environmental stressor, right?
Yeah.
But it's going to have huge economic consequences. Crops fail, people lose their livelihoods, prices spike, and suddenly you've got food insecurity and potential for unrest.
And that can lead to political instability as well.
Exactly. So you see how these different dimensions of fragility can interact and compound each other.
Yeah, that's a really clear example. So the OECD has developed a framework to help analyze all of this, right?
Yeah, they have a great framework that allows us to really delve into these different dimensions of fragility and how they play out in different contexts. And they've got a super useful data platform where you can find all sorts of evidence and analysis on these trends.
Okay. So we've got a better grasp of what fragility is, just how complex it is, and how these different dimensions can really overlap. Now, let's zoom out and look at the big picture. The current state of global fragility. What are the main hot spots that the report identifies as we look ahead to 2025?
The report points to a few key regions as being particularly vulnerable.
Okay.
Sudan's one of them. The Great Lakes region of Africa.
Which is like a whole bunch of countries. Right.
It is, yeah. It's a large area with a lot of ongoing challenges. The Sahel and West Africa are also facing high levels of fragility. And then there's Myanmar.
Myanmar, yeah, we've heard a lot about that in the news.
And unfortunately, out of the 61 contexts that the report identifies as having high or extreme fragility, 24 are actively experiencing armed conflict right now.
Oh, wow.
And 8 are actually in a state of war.
That's really devastating. And it's not just these formal conflicts that are driving fragility, is it? The report also highlights other forms of violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Violence is definitely a major factor. And it's not just about armies fighting each other. We're also seeing this rise in violence perpetrated by non-state actors.
Non-state actors, like who are we talking about here?
So this could be armed groups, militias, criminal gangs, even extremist organizations.
Right.
And then there's the issue of violence against women,
Right.
which is sadly a persistent problem in many fragile contexts.
Yeah.
And high homicide rates in certain areas, and then the growing influence of organized crime, both within and across borders.
So it's like this whole spectrum of violence that contributes to fragility.
It is, yeah. And it underscores the urgent need for preventative action. But sadly, funding for peace and conflict prevention remains stubbornly low.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and focus on a region that's been particularly hard hit by instability, the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA. What are some of the specific concerns that the report highlights there?
Well, the situation in MENA has unfortunately been deteriorating since 2022. We've got ongoing conflicts like the one in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the situation in Lebanon, and the futures of Syria and Yemen are still very much up in the air.
Right.
But what's important to understand is that fragility in MENA isn't just about geopolitics and security. It's deeply intertwined with economic challenges. Like, think about the youth unemployment rates in the region.
Right.
And then there are huge environmental pressures like water scarcity and climate change. And then you've got all those deep-rooted social issues.
So it's like this perfect storm of fragility.
Yeah, pretty much.
And you mentioned a specific country in the Mayday region that's seen a significant downturn. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so Libya was already considered highly fragile in 2022, but by 2025, it's actually moved into the extreme fragility category.
Wow.
And this is due to deterioration across pretty much every dimension: societal, security, political, human, even environmental. Although, interestingly, they've shown some economic resilience.
Oh, that's interesting. So even when a country is doing okay economically, it can still be extremely fragile overall.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected all of these different dimensions are.
Yeah. And the report points to another worrying trend in these fragile contexts. It's about the nature of their political systems.
Right. So there's this really concerning trend towards autocratization. Contexts with high and extreme fragility are becoming more authoritarian.
More authoritarian. So like less freedom, less democracy.
Exactly. And the data shows that between 2019 and 2023, the number of what they call closed autocracies actually doubled.
Wow. So things are actually moving in the wrong direction in terms of political freedom.
They are, yeah. And that has huge implications for long-term stability and development.
So we've got this pretty bleak picture emerging, but let's get a bit more practical. How do experts actually identify and measure fragility? What are the specific indicators that they look at?
So the report dives into a whole range of indicators across those different dimensions we've been discussing.
Okay.
On the economic side, one thing they look at is GDP growth.
GDP, yeah.
Contexts facing high fragility have seen their GDP growth stabilize at around 2%.
2%.
Which might sound okay, but the countries in extreme fragility are actually experiencing negative growth. Their economies are shrinking.
Oh, wow. That's not good.
No, it's not. And another stark indicator is foreign direct investment, or FDI.
FDI.
Basically, how much money from outside investors is flowing into a country.
Right.
And what's really striking is that these highly fragile contexts, despite being home to a quarter of the world's population, attract less than 5% of global net FDI.
Less than 5%.
For a quarter of the world's people.
That's a huge imbalance.
It is. It underscores just how challenging it is to attract investment and foster economic growth in these places.
So economically, we're seeing slow growth, negative growth in some cases, and a real lack of investment. What about the indicators related to conflict and violence?
Well, as you might expect, violent conflict is heavily concentrated in those highly fragile contexts. In 2023, 27 out of those 61 fragile contexts experienced organized violence.
Organized violence.
Yeah. And when you look at all the state-based armed conflicts happening around the world, in the majority of them, at least one of the countries involved is highly fragile.
So fragility is a major driver of conflict. What about those governance and political factors? How do they help us identify fragility?
Well, one key thing is the resilience of state institutions.
Resilience of state institutions. So like how strong and effective the government is.
Exactly. In fragile contexts, those institutions tend to be weak.
Okay.
And that can create incentives for political leaders to focus on short-term gains, transactional decision-making.
So they're not thinking about the long-term health of the country.
Right. They're more focused on staying in power, securing resources for their own networks, things like that. And this can create an environment where events like coups become more likely. We've seen an uptick in coups lately, especially in the Sahel region.
Right.
And then another big challenge, and this is a huge one, is the lack of data.
Lack of data.
Yeah, there's a severe shortage of reliable information, statistics, basic data in many of these fragile contexts.
And why is that such a problem?
Well, if you don't have accurate information, it's really hard to understand the challenges, to track progress, to design effective solutions. You're basically flying blind.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got economic indicators, conflict indicators, governance indicators. What about the social and human dimensions? What do those tell us about fragility?
So on the social and human side, one big concern is the impact on young people.
Young people.
They're particularly vulnerable in fragile contexts, especially when there are limited opportunities for education and employment.
Right.
They might be more likely to get involved in crime, to be recruited by armed groups.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of digitalization,
Digitalization.
the internet, social media, all of that.
Right.
It can create opportunities for young people, but it also exposes them to risks.
Like what kind of risks?
Cybercrime, online exploitation, recruitment by extremist groups, exposure to harmful content.
Right.
And then there's the gender dimension,
Right.
which is really important. The report highlights that 8 out of the 10 contexts with the widest gender gaps are also exposed to high or extreme fragility.
Wow. So gender inequality is a major factor in fragility.
It is, and it goes both ways. Fragility can exacerbate gender inequality, but gender inequality can also contribute to fragility.
Right. And finally, the environmental dimension. How does that play into fragility?
Well, ecological threats disproportionately impact fragile states.
Right.
The report notes that 11 out of 27 global ecological threat hotspots are experiencing high fragility, and another 16 are in extreme fragility.
Wow. So fragile states are really bearing the brunt of environmental challenges.
They are, and these states are often very vulnerable to climate change, to water scarcity, to food insecurity.
Right.
In fact, a lot of hunger hotspots are located within fragile states.
So we've got this complex web of indicators: economic hardship, violence, weak governance, social vulnerability, environmental threats. It's a lot to take in. But having seen all of this, what have we actually learned about how to effectively address fragility around the world?
Well, one key lesson has been that security and development are not separate issues.
They're not.
Nope, they're deeply interconnected.
Okay.
You can't just focus on military solutions or security measures without addressing those underlying development needs. Education, healthcare, economic opportunities, good governance.
It's about tackling those root causes.
Exactly. And there's been a growing recognition that we need to take a much more integrated approach.
Integrated approach.
Yeah. One that brings together different actors, different sectors, different perspectives.
Makes sense. What about those big international organizations? Are they adapting their approaches based on these lessons learned?
Some of them are, yeah. The IMF, the World Bank, they're starting to incorporate fragility analysis into their programs.
Oh, that's good.
And some countries, like Korea, have actually restructured their development cooperation efforts to specifically support fragile contexts.
Okay, so there's some positive movement there.
Yeah, definitely. But another crucial lesson has been the importance of understanding what the report calls local political settlements.
Local political
It's
settlements.
just a bit of a mouthful.
It is. So break that down for us.
Basically, it means understanding the informal and formal agreements, power dynamics, and relationships that shape how decisions are made and resources are distributed at the local level.
So, like, who really holds the power?
Exactly. Who are the key players? What are their interests? How do they interact with each other?
And why is it so important to understand all of that?
Because if you go in with a one-size-fits-all approach, without taking those local dynamics into account, you're much more likely to fail.
Right.
You might even make things worse. You could inadvertently empower the wrong people, disrupt existing power balances, trigger unintended consequences.
So it's about working with the grain, not against it.
Exactly. And that requires a deep understanding of the local context.
So working with the local communities is key.
Absolutely. Ensuring that peace and development efforts are locally owned and driven is much more likely to lead to sustainable success.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But putting all these lessons into practice isn't always easy, is it? I mean, the report mentions some specific challenges in the area of conflict prevention.
Oh, yeah. Conflict prevention is tricky. I mean, one big challenge is just how politically sensitive it can be.
How so?
Well, if you go into a country and say, hey, we're here to prevent conflict, it can be perceived as a threat, like you're meddling in their internal affairs,
Right.
or that you're singling them out as being particularly prone to violence.
Yeah, that could backfire.
It definitely could. So you need to be very careful about how you frame things.
But what's a better approach?
Well, it's often more effective to focus on strengthening local capacities for peace building, supporting civil society organizations, promoting dialogue between different groups, building trust, addressing those underlying grievances that can fuel conflict.
So it's more about empowering local actors to prevent conflict themselves.
Exactly.
What about when it comes to things like security sector assistance?
Mm.
Providing training and equipment to security forces.
So security sector assistance is really important, but it's also really tricky. You have to be very careful about who you're supporting and how you're supporting them.
Okay.
Because if you're not careful, you could end up strengthening actors who are actually undermining stability.
Right. So it's not just about giving them more guns and tanks.
No, it's about strengthening good governance within the security sector, promoting accountability, transparency, respect for human rights. Making sure that security forces are actually serving the interests of the people and not just the interests of a small elite.
Right.
And finally, there's the whole issue of private sector engagement in fragile contexts.
Okay, so how does that work? I mean, it seems pretty risky for businesses to invest in these places.
It is risky,
Yeah.
but there's a growing recognition that the private sector has a role to play in building stability and prosperity.
Okay.
And there's also this growing interest from businesses themselves.
Oh, interesting. So why are they interested?
Well, there are a few reasons. Some see it as a way to access new markets.
Right.
Others see it as an opportunity to make a positive impact, to be part of the solution.
That's great.
But it's really important that this private sector engagement is done responsibly.
Responsibly. What does that mean in this context?
So it means understanding the risks, doing your due diligence, being conflict sensitive, engaging with local communities, making sure that your investments are actually benefiting the people who need it most.
So not just extracting profits and leaving.
No, it's about contributing to sustainable development.
Right.
And finally, we're learning that fragility isn't just a national level issue.
It's not.
It can exist at subnational levels, within regions or communities, even in more stable countries. And there are ongoing efforts to better measure and address this more localized fragility.
So fragility can be really localized.
It can, and it requires a very different approach than dealing with fragility at a national level.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like we've really unpacked this whole idea of fragility.
We have. It's a complex.
Yeah. But I think our listeners are now equipped with a much deeper understanding of what it is, how it manifests, and the challenges involved in addressing it. So let's move on to our final topic, resilience. We've talked about managing fragility, but how do we actually shift from just dealing with the problems to proactively building resilience?
So resilience is really all about strengthening a society's ability to withstand and recover from shocks.
Okay, so like making it more robust.
Exactly. And it's not just about reacting to crises. It's about investing in those underlying capacities that allow a society to bounce back.
Like what?
Well, one key area is focusing on the human dimension. Investing in education, healthcare, social protection, creating opportunities for young people.
Right.
Because if people have those basic needs met, if they have hope for the future, they're much more resilient in the face of challenges.
Makes sense.
And we've seen some really encouraging examples of how gender-focused initiatives can contribute to resilience.
Gender-focused initiatives.
Yeah. For example, in the Gambia, there's been a real focus on empowering women economically. And that's had a ripple effect across society. It's not just about women's empowerment, it's about strengthening the whole community.
Right.
And the report also contrasts different approaches to building resilience in the security sector.
Okay, so give us an example.
Well, on the one hand, you've got approaches like Russia's hybrid tactics.
Hybrid tactics.
Yeah. So these often involve undermining societal resilience while simultaneously strengthening specific security institutions that serve their own interests.
So it's like a very top-down, centralized approach.
It is, and it's very different from approaches that prioritize building resilience across the whole of society.
The whole of society. So more inclusive, more bottom-up.
Exactly. Through things like inclusive governance, respect for human rights, broad-based development.
And that's a much more sustainable approach to building resilience, right?
Absolutely. It's about empowering communities to take ownership of their own security and development.
And the report highlights the importance of local solutions, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to building resilience. It has to be tailored to the specific context.
So what are some examples of those local solutions?
Well, the report talks about some really interesting initiatives in Colombia.
Colombia.
They've been focusing on supporting youth, strengthening food systems, improving access to water. And these are all things that are driven by local communities based on their own needs and priorities.
So it's about empowering people to solve their own problems.
Exactly. And that's what real resilience is all about.
And it seems that even crises themselves can be opportunities to learn and build resilience.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, crises can expose underlying vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
But they can also be catalysts for change.
How so?
Well, they can force people to come together, to innovate, to find new solutions.
Okay.
And if those solutions are inclusive and sustainable, they can actually make a society more resilient in the long run.
So it's about learning from those difficult experiences.
It is. The report gives the example of the uprising in Bangladesh.
Bangladesh.
It exposed deep-rooted inequalities and governance challenges, but it also led to some positive reforms and a renewed focus on inclusive development.
Okay, so it was a turning point.
In a way, yeah.
And what about the role of technology in building resilience?
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about the risks, but are there also opportunities?
Definitely. Technology can be a powerful tool for building resilience.
Okay.
But we need to be very mindful of those risks and make sure that technology is being used to empower people, not to control them.
So how do we do that?
Well, for one thing, we need to address the digital divide. Make sure that everyone has access to the internet and the skills to use it effectively.
Right.
We also need to tackle things like online violence and disinformation, which can be particularly harmful in fragile contexts.
Especially for women.
Especially for women, yeah. And finally, there are strong calls for principled international engagement in fragile contexts.
Principled international engagement.
Yeah. So not just going in and dictating solutions, but working in partnership with local actors, respecting their agency, making sure that assistance is aligned with their needs and priorities. And this is particularly important in places like Afghanistan, where the situation is incredibly complex and fragile.
And the report emphasizes the importance of including women in all of these efforts, right?
Absolutely. Women are often the backbone of their communities, and they have a critical role to play in building peace and resilience.
So it's about listening to their voices and making sure they're at the table.
Exactly.
Wow. This has been a truly deep dive into a really important and complex issue.
It has.
But I feel like we've gained a much clearer understanding of what fragility is, how it manifests, and the challenges and opportunities involved in addressing it. So as we wrap things up, what would you say are the 2-3 key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first of all, I think it's clear that fragility is not a simple problem with easy answers.
Right.
It's multidimensional, it's evolving, and it requires a nuanced and holistic approach.
So no silver bullets.
Definitely not.
Okay. What else?
I think the second big takeaway is the importance of understanding local context.
Local context.
Yeah. You know, what works in one place might not work in another.
Right.
So we need to move away from those one-size-fits-all solutions and really tailor our approaches to the specific needs and challenges of each context.
So context is key.
Absolutely. And finally, I think the most important takeaway is that building resilience is a long-term process.
Long-term process.
It's not about quick fixes. It's about investing in those underlying capacities that allow societies to withstand and recover from shocks.
So it's about building a stronger foundation.
Exactly. And that requires a sustained commitment from all actors involved.
That's a really powerful summary. And it leaves me with a final thought for our listeners. Given how interconnected global fragility is, how can individuals and communities in more stable parts of the world contribute to building resilience in those most vulnerable contexts? It's a question I think is worth all of us pondering as we continue to learn about and engage with this really crucial global challenge. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Always a good time.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll catch you on the next one.
See ya.